Welcome to this timely and important OECD webinar on preparing for the future of work in Canada. My name is John Buck. I'm the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Community Economic Development and Employability Corporation and a member of the board of OECD's Local Development Forum Board. It is my sincere pleasure to be the moderator of today's webinar. For more than a decade, automation has been reshaping jobs throughout the world. The global pandemic has made the challenge of continuing to address this issue more complex as governments limit economic activity in the interest of public health. While recognizing its serious risks and disruptive nature, I think the profound transformation of jobs can be promising if two guiding principles light our way forward. One, we need to adopt a collaborative, no one left behind approach to upskilling. And two, we need to recognize that place matters and that communities need to be positioned as key contributors to and benefactors of forward-looking economic and labor force development strategies. As a collaborative hub of innovative economic and labor force development for the official language minority communities in Quebec and across Canada, CEDEC knows the importance of community in identifying and taking advantage of opportunities inherent in economic and labor market change and transformation, and linking changing labor demand to supply so that upskilling delivers concrete end state benefits like jobs and better jobs for Canadians. Today's OECD webinar will enable us to understand better the implications of automation on jobs in Canada, what is being done across the country to address this transformation, and what additional actions need to be taken to successfully prepare Canadians for the future of work in their country. I'd like to highlight that today's webinar is part of the OECD Local Development Forum, the OECD's forum of local development practitioners, entrepreneurs, and social innovators. With this, I'd like to welcome my friend, Joel Lepin, who will deliver our opening remarks. Joel is the Director for Intergovernmental Relations, Employment, and Social Development Director of Intergovernmental Relations at Employment and Social Development Canada. Joel, welcome and please join us for the opening remarks.
Thank you, John. Mesdames et messieurs, bonjour. Il me fait plaisir d'être avec vous aujourd'hui et de représenter le ministère fédéral de l'Emploi et Développement social du Canada. I want to congratulate the OECD's Local Economic and Employment Development Program for this two-year project, which sheds light on some of the challenges and opportunities facing local labor markets in Canada. And our department is pleased to have supported you in this project. I also want to congratulate Jonathan Barr and Alessandra Candia, who coordinated the project and drafted the report. And finally, I want to acknowledge the contributions of OECD Lead's many partners, which include Government of Ontario, the Ontario Workforce Planning Boards, and the Brookfield Institute for Innovation and Entrepreneurship. Change is a constant in labor markets. People have always had to acquire new skills to adjust to labor market needs. And governments, employers, unions, educational institutions, each has a role to play in order to help people gain the skills needed to flourish. But what is remarkable now, however, is the pace at which those skills must be acquired. So while the report largely spans the pre-COVID era, it also shows some pre-existing trends for which the pandemic may paradoxically act as an accelerant. And indeed, automation, digitalization, artificial intelligence were already reshaping labor markets across the country in the pre-COVID era, and will continue to do so in the coming months and years, of course. What remains unclear, however, is the extent to which the pandemic will refashion those labor markets. And that's one of the topics that this report explores. So in our view, the report is apropos. It comes at a time when policymakers, citizens, business are challenged by the COVID-19 crisis and are seeking to develop innovative, collaborative, and cooperative approaches to help people in business thrive. So this document sets the stage for and seeks to answer some of the questions that may shape the future of labor markets in countries, such as how is Canada prepared to address the challenges that automation, digitalization, and technological change will bring to the future of work? How may COVID-19 influence this process, which is already underway? And what continued urgency, with the continued urgency to address the pandemic's impact on employment, what can we learn about existing current employment and training measures to light a way forward? So I look forward to hearing the panelists on these topics and others, and to what will most likely be a lively discussion. Je vous remercie. Bonne conférence. Thank you very much. Have a good webinar.
Thank you, Joel. Appreciate your opening remarks and glad that you can be here with us today. There, again, a reminder before we hear from Jonathan Barr from the OECD, who will present the report. Reminder that the report is available on the OECD website. It is available, and I'm paying attention to our chat function, the Q&A, and encourage you, particularly as you hear from Jonathan, to start thinking about your questions that we can begin to use to pose to the panelists that will come up shortly after Jonathan's presentation. So with that, I would like to introduce Jonathan Barr, Head of Employment and Skills Unit at OECD. Jonathan will deliver to us the presentation of the new OECD report on local impacts of automation in Canada. Jonathan, welcome.
Many thanks, John, for the kind introduction. And it's my pleasure to be with everybody today to present this new report on preparing for the future of work in Canada. So my name is Jonathan Barr, as was mentioned. I'm the Deputy Head of Division and a Head of the Employment and Skills Unit within the OECD's Center for Entrepreneurship, SMEs, Regions, and Cities. Within the OECD, we're very much a one-stop shop for local and regional development policies. And a lot of our work really comes from the important fact that you need to look at places and how different employment and labor market trends impact places. So as was mentioned, this is a project we've been working on for about 1.5 years. This report, we've consulted over 200 stakeholders. It's about a 150-page document, so I'm only going to have time to present a snapshot of the findings today, but I would definitely encourage everyone on this webinar to please go download the report. One of the really things we've tried to do about this report, because its focus is on the local impacts of automation, is look at different case studies. And in particular, I would like to say thanks to stakeholders in Hamilton, Ontario, Kitchener, Ontario, and London, Ontario. These were 3 cities in the province that we focused on in particular to really try to understand stakeholders' views of automation and the different policies and programs that are being implemented at the local level. So one of the major things that's obviously happened between the start of our project and now is COVID-19. And we really see that COVID-19 has had a significant shock on the Canadian labor market. And the path to recovery remains very unclear. Between February and April 2020, at the heart of the pandemic, employment fell by almost 3 million people. And just to put that in context, basically all of the jobs created since September 2005 have now disappeared. So that's 15 years of job growth taken away in about 3 months. We also see that certain groups of people are really bearing the brunt of the crisis. And when I say specific groups, I mean young people and women. Particularly worrying is we see women's labor force participation rate sitting at about 55% right now. That is the lowest it's been since the 1980s. So we've seen from the labor force survey data that employment is picking up in May and June. In June, for example, about 950,000 jobs were created, but the future and the path to recovery means very much unclear. And what we know about crisis or economic shocks is that they do not have the same impact on all places. That is, some regions and some places will have a harder time to recover. And we looked at data before the COVID crisis, comparing the impacts of the last crisis, the global financial crisis of 2008, and looking at how unemployment recovered to 2019, just before COVID hit. And here you see that many regions across Canada still were facing higher unemployment rates in 2019, before COVID, compared to their pre-2008 crisis levels. So when we look at provinces like Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, you see here on the red bar, they're all highlighted that they had a higher unemployment rate in 2019 than they did in 2008, which is the blue bar. And essentially all of these places had a harder time catching up. So it really shows the impacts of the crisis. We really see COVID-19 as being a game changer going forward. And one of the things we think COVID-19 is likely to do is accelerate automation in the workplace. And we've seen different media articles already highlighting this. History and data shows that automation tends to accelerate in economic crisis as firms replace workers performing routine tasks with a mix of technology and better skilled workers. This structural transformation was already happening, and we think COVID-19 is likely to accelerate it. Particularly, we think that many firms will be looking to technology going forward as a way to pandemic-proof their operations. We don't know how the virus is going to evolve and whether they'll be subject to different lockdown measures going forward, but we see many firms that already had automated processes in place were less likely to be impacted by COVID and have been able to withstand COVID better than others who rely on more people being physically located in the workplace. We also see that firms worldwide are starting to use robots to perform roles that workers can't do at home. And so the International Federation of Robotics projects that about 2 million new units of industrial robots are expected to be installed in factories around the world going forward. When we think about automation, there's really sort of two ways automation can impact a job. You may have seen in 2013, Oxford University conducted a study where they estimated about 47% of jobs could be fully automated or destroyed by 2030. And they did this by essentially looking at different industries and assigning a probability to whether an industry is likely to change or have technology introduced going forward. What we've done is adjust and refine this methodology and look more at tasks within occupations. And we do this to basically look at the different makeup of an occupation based on the OECD survey of adult skills, which gives us data on individual jobs and the tasks within them. And what we really see are two scenarios of change. One is that a job is at high risk. That is, about 70% or more of the tasks could be replaced, essentially meaning that the job will likely be destroyed. But more importantly, I think what the OECD research has really tried to show is that technology will more than likely not destroy jobs. It will destroy a few, but the more important thing is technology is likely to require new skills and result in significant change of jobs. And here we estimate a scenario where about 50 to 70% of tasks could be replaced. And it essentially means that skills training is likely to be required for those individuals to stay in the job. And when we think about technology in the workplace, we have this classical example of a bank teller. And we think about the introduction of and proliferation of ATMs. Did ATMs actually replace bank tellers? In some cases, yes. But the more important thing that happened was bank tellers' roles changed. They became much more customer service oriented as opposed to basic transactions in terms of withdrawing and depositing money. So what is particularly innovative about our report and what we try to do is look beyond national averages and move towards local impacts of automation across Canada. And here you see our estimates at the provincial level in terms of jobs vulnerable to high risk, that is, jobs that could likely be destroyed, versus those at risk of significant change. That is, more than likely the job will remain the same, but the skills required to perform that job are likely to change. And here we see that the share of jobs at risk is highest in New Brunswick. So we've totaled the at-risk and significant change categories. And you see here for New Brunswick, it's about 47.1% or 160,000 jobs. So a fairly significant number, but again, the most important thing here is that a large proportion of those jobs will likely remain, but will undergo significant change. The lowest being Ontario, which sits at about 44.9%, so 45%, or 3.2 million jobs. So that's really a significant number of jobs which could be impacted by automation going forward. And the key thing here is that differences become even more pronounced when we look within provinces. So we've unpacked the local impact of automation on different economic regions across Canada. And here you can see really the scale of risk and vulnerability. So in British Columbia, you can see there are 7 economic regions. If you look at British Columbia at the bottom of the graph, you see the bracket 7. That means this is accounting for 7 economic regions, and it follows similarly for Quebec, where I've looked at 16 economic regions. The risk in British Columbia, for example, between the region facing the lowest and the highest risk is 15 percentage points. So really, again, place matters when thinking about the local impacts of automation. And here, if we look more specifically at Ontario and look at census metropolitan areas, we really see here a number of cities which face particular vulnerability. And here I would like to point out a couple cities in particular, one being Brantford, where we see 18.7% of jobs at high risk of automation, another 33.4% at risk of significant change. So over 50% of the labor market in Brantford could be impacted by automation going forward. And we've here included the number of actual jobs. So in Brantford, of a labor market of around 56,000 people, that's 29,000 jobs that could be impacted by the acceleration of technology in the workplace. Another city to spotlight here is also Barrie, is another region that's also facing particularly high vulnerability. But all of these numbers are in the report, and I would encourage you to go and download it. So some of the key characteristics that we see, what are the things, the economic factors or characteristics that explain why some places are more vulnerable than others? The first is places that face a lower risk of automation tend to be more urbanized. That is, the big cities tend to face a lower risk. Those places that face a lower risk also tend to have a larger services sector. That is, jobs within health, education, finance, insurance, and real estate. Those regions which are predominantly agriculture or manufacturing jobs face a higher risk. And of course, really one of the key factors that best explains the risk is skills. That is, those regions that have more educated workers tend to be more resilient and face a lower risk of automation going forward. These are some of the occupations that we've highlighted. So we basically look at ISCO occupations, which is an international standard of way of classifying occupations. And here you see some of the typical occupations that face a higher risk: food preparation assistants, laborers in mining, construction, manufacturing, and transport, cleaners and helpers. These, you see the average risk across the occupation and the total employment that it represents in Ontario. And the key thing to keep in mind here, again, when thinking about occupational risk, is that those jobs that face the highest risk typically entail routine or repetitive tasks. Those jobs that involve more complicated tasks are those which face less of a risk to technology in the workplace going forward. We also see from the data that automation is likely to impact some segments of the population more than others. That is, low-skilled workers, youth, immigrants, and Indigenous people in a Canadian context. And given the fact that the COVID crisis has already laid a major shock on these groups, it's really something that needs to be thought about from a policy perspective going forward. The good news is we see many regions making a shift. So we've looked at occupational data between 2011 and 2018, and we've basically classified regions in terms of whether they're creating or losing jobs, and whether they're creating jobs in more or less risky occupations, or whether they're losing jobs predominantly in risky or less risky occupations. And here, again, our spatial unit of analysis is Canadian economic regions, and we see that about 35% of economic regions across Canada have primarily created jobs in less risky occupations. So that's essentially looking over the last 10 years that there is this transition happening, which is very good news. And we think, and from the numbers we've looked at, that this represents about 60% of the overall Canadian labor force. Another major trend that we see from the introduction of technology in the workplace is what we call job polarization. And essentially what job polarization is a decline of middle-skilled jobs. And so what we've done is look at what is the relationship between middle-skilled jobs versus lower and high-skilled jobs going forward. And here, essentially what you see is, again, between 2011 and 2008, if you look at economic regions across Canada, about 51, so the large majority of economic regions, have created jobs in high skills. And this basically reflects the fact that as a population, Canada is becoming more educated. And it really shows the responsiveness of the labor market to the fact that more and more people are acquiring higher levels of skills. Because the issue is, when you think of job polarization, is where does the shift happen? Does the shift happen from middle to high skilled jobs? In which case, this could be a very good thing because the population is becoming more educated. However, if the shift is primarily happening from middle to low skilled jobs, that could create structural problems for a regional economy going forward. And here, just to unpack what we've done and looking more specifically at Ontario, is you see that the good news is between 2011 and 2018, that 6 of 11 Ontario regions have shifted from middle to high skilled jobs. So on this graph, just to explain it very briefly, middle skilled jobs are the blue bar, and then high skilled jobs are the black diamond, and low skilled jobs are the white. And you see the 6 regions on the far left, where there's been a shift primarily from middle to high skilled jobs. More worrying is looking, for example, at London or the Northwest region, which encompasses Thunder Bay and Kenora, where there has been a primary growth of middle skilled jobs and a decline of high skilled jobs. So that's more worrisome for these regions because it really shows that they might have more structural adjustments to happen going forward. Another really important point to highlight, and something that's really been on the radar of Canadian public policymakers, is non-standard work. We know that non-standard work has both opportunities and challenges. In terms of opportunities, it offers more flexibility for people who may want that. The challenge is that sometimes these are jobs that do not have optimal working conditions, and they sometimes, more often than not actually, are not covered by basic employment insurance or unemployment benefits. And here you do see large variation in the percentage of non-standard workers. So this is using 2019 data to show the proportion of permanent versus temporary employment across Canada. And again, we see these spatial differences across Canada coming up. And we know that COVID-19 has exacerbated challenges for non-standard workers. Many of these jobs, you're not able to telework, for example, or be at home. If we think of delivery drivers, so they're more exposed to people and therefore more exposed to possibly catching the virus. And this really speaks to the working conditions of some of these workers. So what are the key takeaways from our report? The first is that place matters when examining the potential impacts of automation. The second is that skills development is more important than ever and a really necessary step for recovery. We know that more flexible training opportunities are needed going forward to make skilling accessible to both people and firms. We need more on and off ramps into the education and training system in general. We also know that programs need to embed a combination of job-specific technical skills, but also core competencies. Many firms that we've spoken to, not just in Canada, but all over the world, are looking for people skills. That is adaptability, communication, collaboration, creativity. These are arguably even more important than job-specific skills and help individuals bounce back quicker if they lose their job. We also see community-level responses are really important and can lead to innovation in policy design and implementation. And within this study, we're going to hear from Deb Montigny, located in London, about many of the good things happening there. I would just point another example that we came across in Kitchener, and that's Communitech. Communitech in Kitchener, Ontario. It's very much a community-based organization that's actively working with firms to look at how they use technology in the workplace and really supporting startups. Lastly, monitoring job quality will be critical going forward. So we need to think of ways or opportunities for technology to enhance worker well-being, not diminish it. So going forward, we have a number of recommendations we've highlighted in our report. I'm just going to highlight here some of the top line messages. We think that both federal, provincial, and local governments in Canada need to look for opportunities to build in-demand skills, promote adult learning, especially for those workers most at risk. We think there is an opportunity in Canada to establish an employer skills survey, which could gather comprehensive labor market information and emerging insights on job vacancies, the prevalence of skill shortages, as well as whether firms are investing in training. We also think there's an opportunity to strengthen sector-focused training programs, especially in those sectors which face the highest risk of automation going forward. The transition needs to happen now. And while people are working in a job, they need to be constantly looking for ways of upgrading their skills to remain relevant in the workplace. And so it's particularly important to have employer leadership on this and have firms taking the lead and investing in their employees. Lastly, we know that SMEs in particular face different sort of challenges in addressing their training needs. And SMEs are really the bedrock of many local communities across Canada and represent a significant share of employment. But they face different barriers to training, and in many cases are just simply not aware of different skills training opportunities going forward because they are so focused on the core needs of their business. And we know that COVID-19 has really had a significant shock to many SMEs across Canada. So going forward, as we think about the emergence of technology and the acceleration of automation, we also need to think about how best we can support SMEs in their training opportunities going forward. Lastly, just to finish, what can Canada learn from some other OECD countries? On the employer skills survey, we think there's a very valuable lesson to be learned from the UK that already has a survey of this stature in place. Every year, it surveys about 82,000 employers and has detailed local data across regions around apprenticeship participation, around vacancies, around recruitment, training, and skill shortages. Another great example comes from Ireland. It's called SkillNet, and it's a basically enterprise-led workforce development initiative that supports about 18,000 businesses across Ireland. It's especially focused on networking SMEs to facilitate and share knowledge about their training needs. And these networks then work with different training organizations to organize skills upgrading in the workplace. Australia also has some really interesting things happening, one of which is the Regional Employment Trials Program, which essentially provides grants to local community-based organizations to then implement different programming. And they have government representatives that work on the ground and try to bring together different local stakeholders to think about the programming that the community needs and how to help structural change going forward. And lastly, in the Netherlands, they do a lot around sector-based training funds that facilitate knowledge transfer across sectors and ensure firms talk to each other about their training needs going forward. Just to conclude, again, I would actively encourage everybody to go and download the report. It's on the OECD website. I'm sure if you Google it, OECD reviews on local job creation, preparing for the future of work in Canada, it'll pop up. We'd actively encourage you to look it up. And as John mentioned at the beginning, I'm very happy to take question and answers. If there's any questions on the data or the findings, please be sure to enter them in the Q&A. And just again, as a friendly reminder, people can vote on the questions. So as the panelists go and start talking, if you have different questions, please feel free to pose them and vote on each other's questions as we hope to make this as interactive as possible. So thank you once again for joining us, and over to you, John.
Thank you, Jonathan, for a wonderful presentation, a great summary of the report, and congratulations on the report that is very accessible and beautifully written. The recommendations are clear. As everyone has already seen in the chat, there is a link directly to the report that will bring you to assessments and recommendations, local impacts of automation in Canada, job polarization and changing skills needs at the local level in Canada, and future-proofing people, places, and firms in Canada. Again, just beautifully written. And worth noting once again, today's webinar, part of the OECD Lead Forum. At the OECD Lead Forum, we talk a lot about practitioners, social innovators, individuals that are very much in the world of doing real stuff. And this report, I think, is particularly relevant for those of us that work in that space and can really see some good practices that could easily be put in place in whatever jurisdiction it is that you're participating from today. Communitech, SkillsNet Ireland, and Paul Healy over there, they all do wonderful work and can inspire terrific things for so many of us to be considering as we move forward. So thank you, Jonathan, again. Your summary has provoked a lot of good questions, and I'm glad to see that the chat is filling up with some questions that will be very helpful as we get on to the next phase of our webinar today, where we'll be presenting the panelists who will be speaking to us in a live forum in a few moments from now. We're going to start with, and I'll ask all of our panelists actually to open their video. I'm going to start by asking each one of our panelists a couple of questions. So we have about 40 minutes remaining to go through that phase of the webinar before we get into posing the questions that you as participants are thoughtfully inserting into the chat. And again, if you have a specific question for one of our experts, I'd encourage you to put at and the name of the panelist so that we can make sure that that question is directed appropriately. I will very, very quickly just introduce the faces that you see on the screen, and I promise to do a more elaborative presentation when we get to the panelists, but in no particular order other than being in front of me in the screen in this way. Deb Mountainay, who's joining us, who's on the screen. Wendy Sukier, who's on the screen with us. Diana Rivera, and Sunil Johal. And this brings us to that phase of our webinar that is about the panelists presenting. And I'm going to begin, each panelist will have about 4 to 5 minutes to respond to each one of the questions I pose. I'm going to start with Sunil. Sunil, good morning to you, Sunil. Sunil Johal, who's a fellow at Public Policy Forum in Brookfield Institute. Sunil, thank you for joining us for the webinar. Thank you for participating in this, this activity today. I have a couple of questions for you. I'll start with the first one. Non-standard forms of work, such as gig work, have been on the rise in Canada. How has COVID-19 changed our understanding about non-standard work, Sunil?
Great. Thanks, John, for the question, and hi to everybody who's signed in today. I think Jonathan gave a great overview of a number of the issues I'm going to speak to and hopefully elaborate upon. But in terms of non-standard work, I mean, I think it's important to recognize that there are a number of longer-term trends that are shaping the nature of work in Canada and other advanced economies. So, I mean, if we look at things like rising income inequality, which is at or near record highs in Canada, wage stagnation, declining unionization rates, increased digitization of the economy, less financial security for workers, but certainly the increases in non-standard work are a key component of these trends. I mean, if you look at the numbers, 60% of job growth in OECD economies since the mid-1990s has been in the form of non-standard work. And if we look in Canada specifically, non-standard work accounts for about a third of all employment in Canada. So, I mean, the big question obviously is what's COVID going to do to these trends around non-standard, more precarious forms of employment. So I want to just very quickly touch on 3 things I think are worth paying attention to. So number one is what often is referred to as the unbundling of work. So what would have been a full-time permanent position 20, 30 years ago is turned into a part-time position or a temporary position, a gig position. I think as Jonathan touched on in his opening remarks, it's likely firms are going to accelerate investments in automation to enhance worker and consumer safety in light of the current health crisis we're in. And that also mitigates, obviously, the risks of workers being unable to work due to illness or being otherwise affected by public health mandated lockdowns. I think we're going to see more routine jobs disappear due to the COVID economic downturn. And we're also likely to see consumers turn to more or to cheaper, less labor-intensive types of goods and services as their incomes are challenged. So I think what we can see out of this trend is more automation, and this is disproportionately going to affect low-income earners. So I think consequently, it's going to be challenging to see much wage growth or stability going forward for lower-income Canadians coming out of the pandemic. I think the second trend I want to just quickly touch on, which is related to why I'm sitting in my backyard and we're all sitting in our houses right now. I mean, we're seeing remote work at a scale we've never seen before. And we're already hearing a lot of firms announcing, Shopify, OpenText, many others, long-term strategies that are going to shift their functions to remote working. I mean, this isn't necessarily going to be a short-term trend. I think we can also expect a shift towards more use of online labor platforms. Firms are going to realize that geography takes a backseat to performance. I mean, if you're a worker in Mississauga working for a downtown Toronto firm, guess what? You're going to be pretty replaceable now by somebody based in Mumbai, because all we care about is can you get the job done. And we've already seen kind of pre-pandemic that those online digital freelance postings were on the rise in Canada through platforms like Fiverr, Freelancer, and so on. So I mean, in an environment coming out of the pandemic, where every expense by firms is going to be scrupulously examined, we can expect more tasks to shift online as a way of seeking efficiencies. So I mean, taken together, it's likely that in the years ahead, we're going to see fewer Canadians engaged in standard employment relationships, and they're going to be more tenuously attached to a pretty fissured digital precarious world of work. And I think very quickly, the third trend I would just touch on that relates to these is we're also likely to see more corporate concentration and digitization in the economy. And we're already seeing that firms like Amazon, Microsoft are really making it quite well in this pandemic. The small and medium enterprises in our economy are the ones that are getting hit hardest in terms of revenue declines and employment losses. And this is, again, continuing a longer term trend in terms of consolidation in a number of sectors, whether it's retail, telecommunications, what have you. But that's going to pose a risk for workers and job quality as well. I mean, again, more fissured workplaces with more complex subcontracting arrangements and a smaller number of employers naturally is probably going to mean less competitive labor markets and some form of suppression on wages and benefits going forward. So I wrote a report for the Public Policy Forum that touches on all of these issues. So I'll post a link in the chat, and if people are interested in kind of exploring that in more detail, they can read the report.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much, Sunil. Very good points that you've raised. And I'll follow up immediately with another one. Question of how does policy need to adapt in Canada to promote quality job opportunities moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a number of trends that we've spoken about already that have exposed really major gaps in our social architecture in Canada, and these gaps are only going to become more problematic post-COVID. So whether it's insufficient access to childcare, which is really straining a lot of households right now, gaps in Medicare related to mental health services, pharmacare, lack of affordable housing. I mean, a quarter of Canadians under the age of 30 spend more than half of their income on rent, and retirement savings. I mean, more than half of Canadians over 50 don't have any retirement savings. So, I mean, we need policy transformation across a whole range of different areas to adequately prepare Canadians for the post-pandemic world of work. So whether it's housing, childcare, so on and so forth. But I think three areas really stand out to me in terms of much more specifically and directly related to the world of work. So number one, I think we need labor standards modernization. So I chaired a panel for the federal government last year looking at labor standards in the federally regulated private sector. I mean, a couple of our key recommendations, which I think are more relevant now than ever, is we need to look at boosting the minimum wage in Canada. I mean, we've seen these conversations around essential grocery store workers getting a kind of pandemic boost of a couple dollars an hour, and those are now being scaled back. I mean, we have to ask real questions about if we value those people and the types of work they're doing, why aren't they being paid a decent wage that enables them, if they're working full time, to be above the poverty line, which is not the case, unfortunately, for many workers today who are working at the minimum wage level. I think we need clear definitions around things like who is an independent contractor and who isn't. We're going to see more of that type of gaming of the system by platforms and employers going forward. So labor standards need to be on top of that evolving conversation. And we also need to think about what are some ways we can make it easier for workers to unionize in a digital economy. So I mean, those are some big questions around labor standards. I think the other two areas we need to think about are skills training and EI reform. I mean, Jonathan touched a little bit on the skills training piece. I mean, historically, if we look at skills training in Canada, we've got real challenges around the quality of our skills training programs, who's able to access them. Often for public skills training programs, you have to be eligible for EI to access skills training. Only about 40% of unemployed Canadians right now actually qualify for EI. So what happens to those other folks who maybe weren't paying into the EI system, they were self-employed, they were gig workers, who need to upgrade their skills right now? A, they're not going to have the money in their pocket to pay for that themselves. They don't have an employer who's willing to pay for it, and the government's not providing them access to that skills training. So how do we kind of fill that access gap? And secondly, how do we fill the quality gap? I mean, a lot of the existing programs we've got don't really lead to super successful outcomes. So initiatives like the Future Skills Center in Canada, I think, are long overdue, where we can really create kind of a repository of interventions that work. We can create a bit of a what works center around skills training. If we see interventions that work, we can do the research, evaluate them rigorously, and push that out to service providers across the country. And then the third thing is EI reform. I mean, we're in a state right now where we're going to have a staggered economic recovery. People may be quite slow in terms of returning back to work. They may be in and out of work. How do we make sure they're receiving the benefits they need? So that means lowering the hours threshold. I mean, the CERB has been a great model for how do we deliver support for out of work workers more quickly and more efficiently. And I think we're going to be nearing a period very soon where the CERB is going to have to transition people back into the EI system. So, I mean, there's a whole range of different ideas we can look at there. I won't get into it in too much detail. The paper that I posted kind of gives some of the details, but hopefully we can get into some of that in the Q&A. And I know we've got 3 other great panelists to hear from, so I'll stop there and turn my video off shortly.
Thank you, Sunil. Always a great pleasure to hear your insights, and I'm glad you referenced some of the other reports that you've also produced in the past. They're all great contributions to the discussion, and so many of the topics that you've really nailed here, I think, are very eloquently addressed in the report itself as well. And I'd encourage all participants again to have a good look, not just at the executive summary, but dig into the report, and you'll see so many of the good examples that are also offered there. So thank you, Sunil, and we'll come back to you, of course, in a few moments as we get into the broader open panel discussion. Next person I'll turn to among our panelists is Diana Rivera, who's the senior economist at Brookfield Institute. Welcome, Diana. Pleasure to have you with us today for our webinar.
Thank you for having me.
Following the model we just established with Sunil, I'll have a couple of questions for you and ask you to take maybe 4 or 5 minutes for each of those questions. First up, we're very interested on some work that you've recently done. You recently completed work looking at what types of skills and jobs are likely to be in demand in the next 10 to 15 years through your crystal ball, and we're very enthusiastic to learn what your main findings were. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Absolutely. Thank you, John. I wish we had a crystal ball. But yeah, we recently finished the Employment in 2030 project, and following Sunil's lead, I'll be happy to share a link right after your questions. And to explore the skills and the jobs that are likely to be needed in 10 years, what we did was we created a set of employment projections for Canadian occupations that was driven by the skills of those occupations, the expert opinion, and by the machine learning model that we built. And then we took those projections, and it was really important to us to extend them to demographic data so that we could identify groups of workers who are in areas of the labor market where we might see some risk or where we might see some growth in the next decade. So similar to Jonathan's identifying of those groups who might need that bit of extra help in the OECD report. I do want to point out that we finished this research before the pandemic hit. So these risks and effects are not taken into account into our projections, but we do have that advantage of taking that longer view. And this demographic analysis aspect can really help identify areas where that risk may be compounded by the effects of COVID-19 on different groups of workers. But back to the main findings, similar to the OECD one, it's a fairly long report, but I would put the main findings in about 4 main categories. The first one, and to imagine very little surprise for the room, we are expecting change, and we projected in the occupations of about 1/3 of workers in Canada. So about 19% are in occupations that we project will grow, while about 15% are in those where we project decline in share of employment. So something that we pulled out here was that the jobs that our experts project to grow are often in health and sciences, or have a high degree of service orientation or technical expertise. So here we're thinking graphic designers, chefs, cooks, nurses, are some of the ones that rise to the top. And then on the flip side, the jobs that are more projected to decline are generally in areas like manufacturing and certain agricultural sectors. Secondly, and as I mentioned, similar to some of the OECD's findings, we see pretty clearly that different groups of workers face different realities based on demographic characteristics, including race, sex, immigration history, indigenous identity, their geography. So for example, men are more likely to work in occupations projected to both grow and decline. So maybe having a little bit more opportunity, but also some more risk. Yet women who are in these occupations that are projected to decline make much less than men in these jobs on average. So there's always some nuance in those relationships. And we also find, for example, that over a quarter of men who identify as Filipino, Southeast Asian, Black, or Latin American are in occupations also projected to shrink compared to the average, and this is kind of the really important bit, compared to the national average of 15%. So that's over 10 percentage points higher based on these characteristics that we're seeing. And we definitely find other differences. As I mentioned, I will share the link, but we find enough to make it clear that there are some systemic differences that need to be acknowledged in the design of any policy. I would say our third finding comes from our model being driven by the skills important to an occupation. So it's really driven by that composition for each occupation. And we go pretty in depth, but what I want to share today is what we identified as our foundational skills and abilities. So these are, we have 5, and these are instruction, persuasion, service orientation, brainstorming, and memorization. So here we have 3 social skills, 2 cognitive skills that are basically the skill to teach, to influence opinions, to identify ways to help people, to come up with ideas, and to recall information. And the important bit about these is that they are essentially required for an occupation to be projected to grow under our model by 2030. So, having these skills doesn't guarantee it, but they are pretty much necessary. It doesn't guarantee that an occupation will grow, but it's pretty necessary. And they are very likely, according to what we saw, to make up a pretty substantial part of our labor market over the next decade. So here we see things like, and here we see a lot of backing from the literature, from Jonathan's findings as well. And finally, I think the last picture that I want to give us on this project is that we really set out to provide a complementary picture to other national forecasts, to other approaches that look at the effects of disruption. We wanted to offer a useful complement by looking at a wide set of trends. So from, of course, technological change and automation and the effects that those might have. They're a very important disruption source, but also to things like resource scarcity and maybe other underlying demographic trends. So for example, one of the things we heard a lot across the country was about the potential effects of an aging population. So overall, we were really trying to provide an additional labor market tool and an additional picture of what employment might look like in the next decade.
Thank you, Diana. That's a really impressive work, and I think leading to my next question, knowing what we know now, and having the insight that you've provided into the future. How do skills development programs in Canada need to change or be refined? And are there some good practices out there that we can examine that could help us make the changes that are necessary?
Yeah, so I think in one sentence, they really need to be flexible. I think at this point, we know that the one size fits all approach doesn't work properly to support workers. We know that different workers need different things. Um, and that is particularly true during the pandemic recovery, where we have seen different workers or certain workers disproportionately affected on top of kind of those different realities that they already face. So again, kind of in line with a few of the recommendations in the OECD report, I think program designers, delivery organizations, employment organizations need to know what they're working with. Communities need to know what employers need at a local level, what they might accept as a signal. That might be micro-credentials, that might be involvement in curriculum development, that might be involvement in training, and also what job seekers can offer. So our own work at the Institute is kind of, we're increasingly recognizing this local need, and we're trying to provide an increasingly regional focus in our skills research work as well. And this is true whether you're trying to, identify job pathways available now for disrupted people, or whether you're looking at the skills that might be required in the future. So for example, in the case of our employment in 2030 projections, we actually see that there isn't much variation between what the provinces or territories as a whole in terms of the portion of the workers that are in occupations that we project may change. But we see really big differences within provinces from region to region. And so the breakdown looks very different when you're comparing Ottawa to Windsor to London to Thunder Bay. So that kind of takes me to the good practices aspect of the question. I think it's a really good one. I am sure they are. The problem that we've run into is with information sharing. I think programs like this are often provincial or local, whether within education or labor, as they should be from what we've been saying. They should have that regional focus. But there needs to be an information sharing of these processes. And I want to echo Sunil here as well. We need to know, how do we identify the skills and the skill needs and supply within a community? What is the best way to engage a community? How can we best teach these? Are there any essential or foundational, as we call them, skills that could be taught across the board with other competencies that will build up that base? And how do we teach those? I think these are some of the answers that are out there. There are best practices out there, but we are missing them. And some of that is what we're trying to tackle in our upcoming work, but it is also something that some innovative provincial actors have started to develop in different ways. So again, echoing Sunil, a central resource to store these. I'm thinking here of we've been working with the Newfoundland and Labrador Workforce Innovation Center, and they're trying to do something like this. This is also a place where the future skills center could be really impactful as a central resource. In general, though, I think policies and program approaches that are designed to be adapted to local context before being adopted, I think is the really key priority in this space.
Indeed. Place is important, I think, is definitely one of the takeaways from both what you've just shared and also obviously very significant in the report as well. Diana, thank you very much for your contribution here, and of course, as was the case with Sunil, we'll call upon you in a few moments as we start to look through the chat. For those of you that have talked, Sunil and Diana, you can certainly take a look at the chat and maybe gather your thoughts around some excellent questions that are coming from a variety of individuals, many of which we know play an important role in skills in Canada. And there's a great contribution going through the Q&A right now. And again, I'd encourage all participants, please put your questions in there. Please like as well, so the questions that receive the most likes will raise to the top, and we'll likely try to tackle those first when we get to the open panel. Just a quick note as well, because in that same chat we saw some questions. The OECD report link is indeed live. Sunil's posted a link to his work and a reference to his Twitter account. And you'll also see that Jonathan's noted that this webinar will in fact be available online in the coming days. So keep an eye out there. It's not available immediately, of course, but it will be in the coming days, and you can find a link. With that, we'll move on to our next panelist. And it's a great pleasure to welcome Wendy Sukier. Wendy, thank you for being here with us today. Wendy is a professor in entrepreneurship and strategy at Ted Rogers School of Management. And Wendy is also the director at the Diversity Institute. Wendy, thank you again and welcome. I'm excited to hear the responses to the questions that I'm about to pose to you. It will be the same format as our prior panelists. So we'll take 4 or 5 minutes to answer each one of these. The OECD study finds that some disadvantaged groups may be more exposed to automation. I think Diana's work just revealed that as well in her contribution. What needs to be done from a policy perspective in Canada to promote great inclusion in the labor market?
So thanks very much for the question. And I think both Sunil and Diana highlighted some of the structural inequality that exists in Canada, whether we're looking at the wage gap, whether we're looking at the crushing burden of unpaid work on women, whether we're looking at the marginalization and exclusion of newcomers, Indigenous people, and certainly in recent weeks, we've had a real laser focus on the role of Black racism in the system. So I think, one of the things that is critical to developing solutions and policies that work is making sure that we're naming the problem and understanding the problem really from the outset. And everything that's, I think the report's terrific in terms of identifying where skills gaps may exist, how occupational segregation means that, for example, women are underrepresented in high-paid ICT jobs. Frankly, so are Indigenous people and Black people. Similarly, we know that low-skilled men are more likely to be dominant in some of those areas that are most at risk, manufacturing, for example. So the kind of granular and nuanced understanding of how the risks of automation, but also COVID, are going to impact different segments of the population, critically important. We just published a report, for example, with the Canadian Aboriginal Business Council looking specifically at automation and its impact on Indigenous people. And again, the structural concentration of Indigenous people in certain occupations, the chronic undereducation of Indigenous people means that they're far more vulnerable when it comes to the impact of automation and also COVID. Similarly, the work just related to the work that Sunil's done with the Public Policy Forum. I lead the research stream at the Future Skills Center, and we've published a whole series of reports looking at those specific populations and how structural factors make them more vulnerable. And of course, we need, therefore, to have a really good understanding of where those vulnerabilities are and so on. But the second piece that I think is really critically important and often is not interrogated sufficiently is what employers are or are not doing. And so, for example, when we look at immigrants, we know that if you have a, quote, foreign sounding last name, with an identical resume to someone with an Anglo-Saxon name, you're 20% less likely to get called for an interview in a large corporation, 40% less likely to get called for an interview at an SME. So when you have companies screaming about the shortage of engineers and computer scientists, and you look at the reality that 40% of internationally educated engineers are underemployed in Canada, I think that really makes it clear that this is not just an issue of supply and fixing the job seekers or the workers. It also requires us to take a hard, cold look at what's happening on the employment side. And so while I agree 100% that having national surveys of employers identifying where they see gaps, I think we need to triangulate that data with looking, for example, at actual job postings and start to really unpack the difference between assumptions or signals of qualifications versus what the skills are that are actually needed to be successful. And this is particularly important when we look at things like post-secondary education or credentials as a marker. We know that Shopify, for example, is one of the companies that's just saying, you know, we actually don't care. What we're interested in our skills and competencies. So we need to really start to take up a hard, cold look at some of the employment practices. We need to look very carefully, in my view, and even in this discussion, we've already seen a lot of different frameworks and language around skills, competencies, and so on. We need to develop common understanding of what we mean by skills versus tools. So I would argue, for instance, that when we look at digital skills, and we've done some research in this, you really have to distinguish between, a demand for full stack Java developers or someone with a computer science degree or somebody who is actually developing AI applications versus somebody who can use Excel, SQL, and analyze data. Because if you don't break down what you mean very specifically and precisely by digital skills, often you will use credentials like a computer science degree as a marker for who can do a job or not do a job. And often that's completely misrepresenting what is actually required. I mean, there are lots of really innovative programs, for example, that will show that you can take a fine arts graduate and turn them into a data analyst in a week and a half. It'll take you 3 to 4 months to produce a full stack Java developer. Programs like Empower have shown that in a matter of months, with appropriate wraparound services, commitments from employers, work integrated learning, and so on, you can take marginalized youth and transition them into well-paid IT jobs. But fundamentally, in order to do that, we need a common language and understanding about what the skills actually are that are required, first off, how we're going to assess and measure those skills so that we have more objective measures than he's a friend of my golfing buddy, which is the way that a lot of employment occurs in this country, and then have a very focused strategy for how you develop those skills and looking at alternative pathways. And I actually believe that if we crack some of those systemic problems and really push for evidence-based approaches to defining what skills are actually required, to measuring those skills, and to developing those skills, and really crack open organizational hiring practices to expose systemic discrimination, bias, unconscious or other. That's actually part of what we need to really level the playing field. And so in terms of government policy, for me, it's not a question of one policy or another. Certainly, in the current environment, we see very clearly that if we don't address the childcare and homeschooling issues, we're rolling back the clock by decades. Certainly, it's very clear that when organizations take intentional positions to really look at representation and say we are going to increase participation among our employees by Black people by this much, all of those things are really important. But to me, fundamentally, what is hampering our ability to move forward on a lot of these issues, and I think Diana sort of alluded to it, is that we have lots of good little bits and pieces that may or may not work, but we have lots of programs that are training people for imaginary jobs. We have lots of employers who are saying there's a skills gap when they're looking in the wrong place. And if we take more of a systems approach to this, and we really unpack what skills are needed, how we're going to measure them, and how we're going to develop them, that will actually level the playing field for many of the people who are excluded. We also need, we also need to really understand that information doesn't get you very far. If you're looking at how to change behavior, whether it's within organizations or whether it's among job seekers, you have to really unpack, behavioral economics and what leads someone to pursue an upskilling opportunity, what leads somebody to reconsider whether they will hire someone who looks like them or doesn't look like them. We need a lot more attention on how we shift behavior and drive change. And that's why I think, social innovation models, which are really informing the work of the Future Skills Center, are so important.
Thank you for that, Wendy. Such an interesting points. And something I find so compelling in what you've shared are really those three aspects in terms of being able to articulate skills and competencies that are required, measuring them, and then working on the development. And the report alludes to, the challenges that SMEs encounter in this, and particularly alludes to challenges in skills development, skills refinement. But of course, if we don't start with articulating what skills are required, then it becomes that much more complex to figure out what should be developed moving forward. And I really appreciate your contribution. And again, I think that's a compelling part of the report that I know everyone here is going to read along the way. The next question, Wendy, that I'm going to pose to you is I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit here with this one. It says, what specific project or examples exist in Canada that you think are best practices when it comes to promoting digital skills training?
Well, I think that, one of the things the Future Skills Center is committed to doing, again, picking up on Diana's point, is trying to create a repository of what works, what doesn't work, because frankly, we are investing, and the Auditor General of Ontario showed this very clearly. We're investing in English language training programs that don't result in language skills at a higher level than if someone drove Uber. We're investing in training. We're selling people, frankly, a bill of goods, particularly, I would argue, newcomers, where we say we'll put them through a program to bridge them into an occupation, and there are no jobs at the end. So I think that, I'm going to be parochial because I know some programs better than others, but I would just point people to the Future Skills Center and some of the material that's coming out of there in the database, which is highlighting lots and lots of programs. But I'm really taken with challenging traditional assumptions. Okay, so the programs that I like are the ones that are challenging traditional assumptions. We know that there's a high demand for computer scientists and engineers. Of course, we need more women in those occupations. What I'm really interested in, though, is how we look at women who have graduated in philosophy, history, or social sciences, and how we transition them into technology programs. So the ADAPT project, which is one that Future Skills is financing, really focuses on that. And the way it does it is by putting employers at the center doing the analysis of the skills that they want, and putting a big priority on work integrated learning. Because our experience has been, and full disclosure, I was a history major before I started working in IT. Often if you get people into jobs and they demonstrate their value, they will keep those jobs, even if their qualifications don't necessarily match with what was required. And I can show you examples of fine arts graduates who are now consultants at Boston Consulting Group, because they were able to navigate very different pathways. So ADAPT for me is an interesting one. Actua and Fire Spirit, which are both programs, again, looking at alternative pathways for Indigenous youth, and challenging some of the assumptions about, first you go to high school and then you go to university and then maybe you'll get a job. I think some of those programs really interesting. Empower, which I mentioned, takes marginalized youth, again, because employers are partners and central to the work. It's over 80% success rate of transitioning kids that you would have expected to be working, as at low skill jobs into tech jobs that actually make their careers. I'm a big fan of putting more onus on employers and looking at what works in terms of upskilling. So we've done a project recently where we looked at sort of best practices and what happened at AT&T in the States, for example, where they literally retrained, they invested over $1 billion, literally retrained 50% of their workforce, and will argue there was a return on investment. We've got lots of those examples, even in Canada, that I think are critically important. And again, challenging the traditional assumptions about the boundaries between school and work and learning and so on. And I think the final one I'll mention, again, because it's perhaps one of my passion projects, is thinking about entrepreneurship as a pathway to skills development, especially for newcomers, marginalized populations, people with disabilities, because often those populations don't fare particularly well in traditional classroom environments. In my own experience, working with Syrian refugees, for example, is the men had 7 words of English and wanted to start working. And so putting them in an English class for 6 months was torture. And entrepreneurial training, when you think about it, is a kind of experiential learning where you can teach people culture, you can teach them language, you can give them a bit of Excel and finance and sales. And whether or not they become an entrepreneur is sort of irrelevant, because many of the skills that they will develop will position them for other kinds of employment. So I'm a big fan of rethinking where entrepreneurship training fits. And we've got projects with IECBC, with Scatting Court, with the Black Business Council, the Black Business Professional Association, that are looking specifically at how to exploit those opportunities to engage people in new kinds of learning and new formats. So I think challenging the status quo, being prepared to try things and kill them if they don't work, but I think that's where the secret lies.
Thank you, Wendy. That's very inspiring. There are so many challenges, but so many innovative approaches out there, and we appreciate you shedding some light on that. It's very exciting. I know many of us will go off and research some of the references that you just shared. So thank you, and we'll have you back in a few moments as we get to the panel. Encourage all participants. Your time is winding down in terms of being able to vote for questions and to submit your questions to panelists. We will be getting to those questions after we speak with Deb for the next few moments. So again, please go to the Q&A and share your questions there. Deb Mountenay, thank you for joining us today. I'll encourage you to come off of mute. Deb is the Executive Director for Elgin Middlesex Oxford Workforce Planning and Development Board. Deb, it's a terrific pleasure to have you with us. Of course, as we talk about how place matters in the report, we know that your place is part of the report. And so I think we're all looking to the great insight that you're going to be able to provide us. So again, welcome and thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you, John. It's a pleasure to be here today. London certainly was one of the areas that was highlighted in the report. And as we've heard, policy and what areas the governments can put in place to give direction to programs and services is very important. But when it comes right down to it, what really matters is what happens on the ground in those local communities. And so I'm happy to be able to talk to you about what's been happening in London and region as a result of COVID-19.
Absolutely, and I think that's a very timely place for us to go. Of course, is our recent experience is so unprecedented, and I think everyone would be very, very interested in hearing the main labor market impacts in London as a result of COVID-19.
Prior to the actual start of COVID-19, we actually had an unemployment in the London economic region that dropped to our lowest rate since 2000. So unlike some of the other areas that were highlighted in the report, we were actually sitting at 5.3% for 2019. So what we were hearing from employers through a local annual employer survey that we conduct every January was that employers were anticipating growth in 2020, and primarily that was due to expansions. We're seeing from across the board, employers were saying that they were looking for people. So when you look at the impact of technology and the advancement that we were seeing of technology and AI coming into the workplace, it was actually somewhat welcomed within our area as well, because we were already experiencing shortages across different sectors. But once we hit that shutdown in Ontario, that really created basically a creative pause where our businesses were forced to stop delivering their product or service as they had in the past, and they had to look at how they could keep their business going. And we took a look at what we were doing and how we did it. And out of that, employers had to take a look at how they could use technology. They had no choice if they wanted to continue to do business during the shutdown. And out of this, we're seeing some businesses will be retaining some of the technology pieces that they'd added in. This is now a new facet of their business. They may be adjusting the times that their businesses are open because they're now also doing business online in a much larger fashion than they would have before COVID hit. In some cases, some businesses were already moving in that direction, and basically what's happened with the advance of the COVID shutdown was that the learning curve really shortened to days rather than weeks or months that businesses might have planned in doing a transition. So collectively, we've actually proven that those short-term intensive training programs can provide immediate benefits. And that is also one of the recommendations out of the OECD study. So we're seeing more and more changes happening as far as the businesses looking at how they deliver their services. We're also seeing them taking a look at what types of changes they will be continuing. So in the case of manufacturing, we are also an area that's high in employment in agriculture and in manufacturing. Some of our manufacturers actually then moved to providing PPE products. And so now they will be making the decision on how much of that new subsector that they have entered, are they going to be continuing with, or are they going to be moving back to what was their original product solely? So a lot of questions still to be answered, but we've seen a lot of changes happening in the local community.
The question of COVID-19 and the future of work are so very interesting, because of course we've seen so many things that we anticipated might be the future of work just arrive on our doorstep much more rapidly as a result of the circumstances imposed by COVID. So that experience that you're dealing with is just tremendously compelling, very, very interesting. And thank you for sharing that. I know, Deb, that there's a lot of work going on where you are to manage, and I wonder, how are organizations working with firms in London to help them adapt to new forms of work and technological change in the workplace?
Thanks, John. Many of the local activities and programs that are offered in the London economic region really mirror the recommendations in the OECD report, although we're conducting them on a much smaller scale. And as has already been noted, there's really no direct correlation between specific things that we're doing in our area and what other areas might be doing. The information doesn't flow entirely across different areas at this point in time. We have been producing a labor market demand information, as I mentioned, with our employer survey, and that's been going on since 2013, which was the first year that we introduced the annual employer survey. The survey asks about hiring and recruitment challenges, hiring intentions for the coming year, and what skills employers are looking for in the new hires. And we conduct that survey with a wide range of community partners every January. So for the past 7 years, we've really been creating a cohesive group that's regularly talking with employers to find out what their needs are. As a result of COVID, we're undertaking an employer needs assessment over the next 2 to 3 months. Again, back with many of those same partners that work with us on the employer survey, the Employer One survey that we do on an annual basis. And we're going to be determining what can be done to assist employers to help them hire or rehire employees in the immediate future. We'll also be looking a little bit beyond that because, as I said, there were expansions that were anticipated and were scheduled prior to COVID taking place. So a lot of what is happening in the local community as well is working with the employers to see how much of that still remains on their books as things that are moving forward. So that will be also part of what we're hoping to hear about as we're out talking with the employers. Over the past 2 years, the local nonprofit agencies and services have increased their level of collaboration and working with local businesses on what we refer to locally as ramp-up activities to help employers with significant hiring needs so that they can find the employees that they need to be able to expand their businesses. One example was with a company in Oxford County. They were looking for 475 employees that they needed to hire between September and December. And the collaborative group got together and successfully were able to help them in recruiting and training employees to be able to meet those targets. So from there, that was really the first example of the collaborative hiring process that they were doing at the local area, where all different agencies were feeding employees or potential employees into the system to be able to make those matches with the employers. And so that's continuing with individual employers and on an ongoing basis, although again, interrupted by the COVID crisis, but we've already had employers talking about continuing to do hiring through that process. And that will be starting up this fall again as well. We also have created a local jobs hub. This has actually come from Workforce Windsor Essex. So it was a system that was put together in Windsor and has now been rolled out to 14 different areas across the province. In our area, we call it the local jobs hub, and it provides tools for job seekers, including a job board that aggregates postings from national job boards, but also from our local job boards, which we feel is really important as many employers will post on some of these local job boards, which aren't necessarily picked up in other job aggregators. Along with that, there's a mapping tool so individuals can go on and take a look to see where jobs are located relative to the bus routes within the city as well, so that if they need a job that's close to home, or they have transportation issues and they need to be able to find a job that they can use public transit to get to, that gives them that opportunity. And there's also career tools tied in with that. And most recently, we've begun logging remote jobs so that we can help job seekers to reconnect to employment so that it gives them an opportunity to search the job board, looking specifically for those remote jobs for any individuals that have to work from home. And we're finding, as was mentioned, that's the case for a lot of women because there's still a lot of uncertainty around, first of all, what will happen with the schools in the fall, but also currently a lot of childcare situations where they expected summer camps to run and they're not running, and or they've got changes happening within the existing childcare that they've had to space people out more in order to meet the COVID requirements as well. And so it seems to be disproportionately the women that are being affected by the childcare responsibilities. And that is certainly an issue that we're hearing from local employers as well, that they've had employees that they've attempted to bring back to the workplace who aren't able to come back at this point in time due to the childcare situation. So it's an area that has become a much higher priority for everyone across the community. The employer-directed training is happening in the local area as well to try and bring individuals back into the workplace. So funding programs such as the Canada-Ontario Jobs Grant will be important for the upskilling of employees. Also, there are Skills Advance Ontario programs that are being created locally, and those are, again, reflecting direct employer input into the curriculum pieces that are being created. And there are also similar types of programs that are funded through the federal level that are happening. Also, there's a micro-credential project that's underway at Fanshawe College as part of the Rapid Skills pilot projects funded by the Ontario government. And in fact, all of Fanshawe programs are designed with the needs of business in mind. So there is a lot of interaction that the community college has directly with employers, as do all of the businesses and the employment services in the local community, doing regular reach out with the employers. And certainly on the literacy and basic skills side, there's a lot of work that's being done around career laddering under the direction of Literacy Link South Central, which is our literacy network for our area. And they're also actively involved with quite a bit of work around digital literacy. And we know that digital literacy is going to be such an issue across the community going forward. As we see the advance of technology and AI in the workplace, it's creating a larger gap between those who have the skills and can find employment within the workplace and those who don't have the skills and therefore are not getting the opportunities within the workplace. And of course, working in conjunction with the economic development offices, the workforce planning boards, particularly in Western region, have been working with their economic development organizations since about 2007. So we've got some long-standing relationships there that we're continuing to work with economic development, with the municipalities, and with all of the different partners across the community to try and look at how we can diversify the subsectors of our economy. The reality is, from a manufacturing standpoint, given our prime geographic location and our access to border crossings into the United States, plus our area having a strong technical workforce with high college graduate level and generally a high skilled trades level, we continue to attract the interest of manufacturers. So as they're moving out of the GTA potentially, due to higher costs of land and facilities, they are moving to this area. So while we're recognizing some of the issues that would be associated with that vulnerability to technological change and putting some positions at risk, this is also the area that is really attracting that manufacturing base simply because of our geographic situation and our skills situation. And so as a result of this, we expect that we're going to be continuing to see the manufacturing sector as being strong. within Ontario, you know, if there's one manufacturer left, it's going to be in the London economic region. So we tend to be attracting them. And of course, from an agricultural perspective, if you've got excellent soil, you're in agriculture. And so that piece is going to continue as well. So for us, part of what we're looking at in the local community is, given that those two are going to continue to remain in our area, how are we adding in additional pieces? And that's where groups such as Tech Alliance in our area, which is our counterpart to Communitech, is very vital for bringing in some of those higher skill employers into the area so that we can continue to grow those occupations as well.
Thank you very much. What wonderful activity your area, of course, is in the report, and encourage all participants to have a look. Thank you for that. Future of work is very promising indeed in your area, and it seems that you're doing some wonderful things to make sure that that's the way that things turn out. We are approaching the end of our time together. It's 11. I want to verify with the panelists. Diana, I'll ask you perhaps to come back onto video if you're able to. If any of our panelists need to leave before 15 minutes from now, does anyone have less than 15 minutes available? Okay, thank you very much. I think this discussion has been absolutely wonderful. Of course, stemming out of a very compelling report, and our participants have so diligently put questions out there, very good questions, and I want to make sure that we do have an opportunity to ask them. For participants, again, we are at the originally scheduled end time. If for some reason you do need to depart, we will make this all available online. There will be a video that captures this segment of the webinar as well. For those of you that can stay with us, we'll go for another 15 minutes to try to tackle the questions that have been posed the most. Based on these questions, I'm going to do my best, panelists, to maybe put them out there. If someone has the desire to answer first, please just raise your hand and I'll go to you. Otherwise, I'm going to attempt to, just in the course of the 15 minutes, kind of call out each of us to be able to respond to a question. So that will give you an indication of the amount of time as well, perhaps, for us for each question. The first question I'll pose, and I don't know if Sebastien asked this question or if he was just the last person to like it, but I'll ask the question that is there, is how can governments in Canada and abroad reconcile the need to foster skills training, reskilling, and the fact that a significant number of individuals were underemployed before the pandemic, i.e. were overqualified for their position? Panelists, is there anyone that would like to take a stab at that before I choose someone? Jonathan?
Yeah, no, I think it's a very good question. And in our report, we actually have a whole chapter. I focused less of it on that chapter in my presentation because I tried to focus more on the automation results, but it's a whole chapter around skill shortages. And indeed, we really show a lot of interesting data in there, including provincial level breakdowns around under and overqualification. What we've seen, and it's not just an issue within Canada, but it's internationally, is massive investments over the last decades by governments in education and training. And you see that because when you look at educational attainment as an indicator, and I know it's a very crude indicator, and there are problems with looking at that indicator as the only indicator to measure skills, but you've seen massive growth in terms of the number of people that are becoming more educated and acquiring what we call tertiary education. So this would be a college or a university degree in Canada. And one of the challenges with this is, in fact, so we're developing this supply, but it's not being put to good use in the workplace. And so one of the key issues we've really been focusing on in the OECD is looking how do you stimulate the demand? So that is, how can firms be provided incentives or given more information to look at how they're using the skills of their employees better? And so one way of measuring this, and we've included the results in our report, is what we call high performance workplaces. And that is firms that typically demonstrate a high performance workplace practice, which involves things from job rotation strategies, employee recognition programs, employee-manager relations, by giving the employee more autonomy in how they do work, firms that exhibit these practices tend to better use the skills of their population, resulting in less skills mismatch. One of the really interesting things about the UK survey that I mentioned as an example is they're actually asking firms about this. And again, it's across the UK, it's a national level survey, but they're actually asking firms, to what extent they're implementing components of what they define as high performance workplaces. Of course, in a Canadian context, this would have to be, looked at, but from what we've seen from this review and other work we've done in Canada, is there's not comprehensive information that's reliable in terms of employer investments in training. And it's a big information gap right now. And we see that as something fundamental going forward. And I recognize there's lots of good local initiatives that are happening that have been talked about by the panelists, but having this type of information would really be important for policymakers going forward. And I think then also thinking of different ways that public policy can work with firms to get them thinking more critically about how they're using skills in the workplace is fundamental. And I think each of the panelists has really highlighted lots of really great ideas. I'm not going to speak more than that because I want to give other people a chance to talk, but just to say we do have some information on that as well. And please look at chapter 2 of the report if you're interested in that. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Sunil, you raised your hand.
Yeah, just building on what Jonathan said, I think we also need to think about the fact that, we're not in a closed system here. Jobs are kind of flowing in and out of countries, and that's only going to increase with digitization of the global economy. So, how do we make sure that we are creating enough good jobs here in Canada? And one of the things we need to think about is, what are those factors that cause workers and firms to set up shop in a particular country? And it's not necessarily what skills training programs do you have. That's important, but it's what's the quality of your healthcare system? What's the quality of your communities? Are you a diverse place to live? Do you have cultural attraction? So I think kind of looking at from a macro point of view, policymakers can't lose sight of those bigger quality of life considerations, which I think are going to be increasingly important as firms decide where to set up shop for those kind of higher quality white collar types of professions that all countries are chasing. So I'll just stop there.
Thank you, Sunil. Maybe Diana, I have you in mind based on your contribution earlier as I see the next question. For those participating outside of Canada, federal, provincial jurisdictions are always a significant question for us as we figure out how to proceed with certain things. Certainly the future of work is impacted by this. Diana, you alluded to some great examples you saw previously in certain jurisdictions and the need for us to centralize information. I wonder if you'd have any thoughts on this question that I see that reads, curious to hear from the panelists about navigating the tensions between a federal focus on skills development versus provincial responsibility for education.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and in many ways the tension is undeniable. I also, the first thing that comes to mind, and something that I want to reiterate that we have been talking about, is that idea of place. I think the needs for each province are going to be very different. And I think the responsibility for finding what those needs might be and for the best ways to address them at the regional, at the local level, I think really need to come from those communities. I think that will increase that sense of trust from governments at different levels in what the findings are, in the motivations behind them, in what they're hearing from the workers and from the employers on the ground. And what I think what we really need is kind of that central place that is looking at how we find these approaches, how that research is done, so that it can then be done and replicated in other places. So for example, what Deborah was saying about the local job board coming from Windsor, Essex to other communities in a way that other communities can adapt them, like that is a connection at a cross-municipal level. So it's a it's a smaller scale, but that is a channel of communication, and an example of what we can do once those approaches are a little bit more shared. I do think that, and in my conversations with different provincial actors, I also think that provincial organizations and provincial governments are focusing on skill development. So while yes, it's definitely a federal focus, it is also increasingly a provincial priority, and something that people are working on. But I think that collaboration method really has to be built on the basis of everyone needs different things.
Thank you, Diana. I'm going to keep us moving along through the questions, and I am going to take some liberties as the moderator here in that the references to the report, I'm just going to encourage you to read the report. Most of the things that individuals have posed questions about are in fact addressed there, and so I'd encourage you to go and have a look at that report that is available at a link in today's chat, as well as I should mention Wendy has posted some really interesting research that she's been involved in as well that's in that chat. I'm going to take us to one of the other questions, and perhaps for Wendy or for Deb as our time approaches the end, I'll ask the secondary education role. Do we think there is a role for secondary education to play in adapting their curriculum to also better prepare students for the ever-changing world of work? Deb or Wendy, would either of you have any thoughts on that question? Wendy?
I can start. I'm a bit, and I posted this in the link, I'm a bit of a heretic. I did a master's degree in medieval history and I wouldn't trade it for the world. I supported my daughter doing a master's in fine arts at Parsons, spending her inheritance before I'm dead, because I believe when it comes to post-secondary institution, you should study what you love. And I really think that we have done the world a disservice by prioritizing STEM without a really nuanced understanding of the limitations of STEM alone in driving innovation, economic development, and so on, and the importance of social sciences and humanities. So even though I teach in a business school, I actually think that, they can't fire me, I have tenure. I actually think I can teach you the most important things I learned, or at least I remember from my MBA, in a couple of weeks. I don't actually believe that there has to be that direct relationship between what you studied at university and what your jobs are. That's why I'm a big believer in this idea of multiple pathways and really putting more focus on what I would call post-secondary adjacent intermediaries that can help people develop skills, work integrated learning, and so on. Because universities, and I love them, are very slow to change and adapt, and the barriers internally to putting more focus on professional training, education, coding, teaching coding, from the time you're in utero all the way through. I think that's a losing battle. I think we need to think more about flexible and adaptable models, and of course, take advantage of things like advisory councils and, try to create more awareness among students of career paths and so on. But I think it's a mistake to give up on teaching philosophy because you want to train people to, work in sales and marketing. I think you can do both very effectively.
Thank you, Wendy. Thank you very much for that. I like that reference to study what you love. The last question, I have a fondness for the person who takes the risk to put the first question out in the chat. And so I'm going to go dig deep. And Deb, I think this might be a really appropriate question to share in your direction. It says, how do you see this affecting the transportation industry, given that technology is advanced with respect to automated vehicles? And we know, and I think we could expand beyond transportation industry, but we know that that's a really important dimension of the economy where you are, as we talk about places. What does the future look like in that context? I think the autonomous driving is always a future of work reference, and maybe we can go beyond that and see what your thoughts are around that.
Well, from a workforce standpoint, we were quite excited to hear about how the advancements were coming in automated driving, because our demand for truck drivers or drivers within the community was very high pre-COVID, and we were anticipating that continuing. And there's quite a shortage already without any additional demand coming into that. Going forward, I see that piece is still going to continue to be an issue, because as we're seeing more businesses now also looking at how they can move into that delivery model where people can purchase online and more of their products as well can be delivered. We're seeing local delivery companies picking up a bit more speed as far as having other types of services they're delivering. We're seeing food delivered from all kinds of different companies post-COVID that weren't actually doing that type of a delivery method pre-COVID. So I think there's going to be a lot of interest in how all of the automated pieces can come into the transportation sector. But safety, of course, is still a paramount issue. And we're seeing a lot of people questioning, the broader public transit systems where you're going to be in with more people. So that individual automated piece may become much more of an interest within the local area as well.
Thank you, Deb. And this will bring us to the end of our panel. We are a little bit over time, about 20 minutes. I want to thank Deb Mountenay, Wendy Sukier, Sunil Johal, Diana Rivera. Thank you for being part of our panel at today's webinar. Thank you to Joël Lépine from ESDC for the opening remarks. And of course, Jonathan Barr and team at OECD, thank you for a wonderful report that I encourage everyone to read. Again, you can access it through the link in the chat here, or if you're watching this via the webinar in the future, it will be available on the OECD website for you to download. And finally, let me also thank all participants. I see we're still in the above 100, which is great, 20 minutes after the end. Thank you very much for your time today, and thank you for being part of what has been a wonderful webinar with OECD. With that, we will close our webinar and wish you all a very good rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you.